After d4, d5 and bishop g5, the Pseudo-Trompowsky is on the board. As mentioned in the first video of this series, we need to play c5. So we're going to go through a few lines that we didn't see in the first video. What happens after the white player takes the pawn in c5? This is very popular and white wants to blockade the entire queen side with pawns in order to keep the pawn advantage forever. Now here we have to do a simple thing, h6, and get the bishop away so that we can develop our bishop and win some tempos on the bishop whilst we develop our dark square bishop on the fianchetto. So let's say bishop h4 for example, g5 and bishop g3. Either way, even if the bishop had gone to f4, it will still end up in g3 after the pawn push. Now bishop g7, attacking the pawn. So now the white player has to do something about the possibility that black has of trapping the rook. Either c3 or knight to c3, for example. Let's look at them. Knight to c3 is terrible because black plays d4 and the knight has to move. Then where? If the knight moves to d5, then this wins a piece for black. f5, the knight has to move. Well, there are no squares except d2, but then f4 traps the bishop. If the knight, after being attacked, goes to b5, there's a fork. Queen check and wins the knight. If the knight goes to a4, then again there's a fork, and you might argue it might be stopped with c3 while the queen defends the knight, but no, actually you take the pawn, and now you're threatening to take the pawn with the discovered check and winning everything. There's nothing here that works. b4, for example, with the attempt of swapping everything, is the best reply by white. You can just take the pawn, and after queen b3 trying to swap, black simply goes back to a5, keeping the threat. There's two pieces defending c3, so white cannot take yet. Rook c1 cannot be played because c2 is check, and that's mate next move. So here the best move according to the engine is long castle. Black now plays bishop e6, winning a tempo on the queen, and the queen has to move while still defending the knight, otherwise black can win a free knight. So queen a3, black plays b5. The idea is to take the knight, of course. So white taking a passant seems like he can still hold things together, but black now simply takes back and is threatening the knight once again, and it's game over. White can try a cheeky move e3 with the idea that if we take the knight now, then the bishop can play b5 check, and after taking, then the queen can take a rook in a8. So that's a fork, it's a sacrifice. Black will still be better, but black's best move now is knight to d7, and there's nothing now stopping the black player from winning a lot of material. From the start, after d4, d5, bishop g5, c5, we're looking at the variation with pawn takes. Okay, then h6, and then the bishop moves away, and then you can win a few tempos whilst developing the bishop in full safe. So after the move knight c3, we mentioned that this is terrible. Let's have a very quick look at what happens after d4 and knight going back to d1. Let's just talk about the ideas in general so that we understand how wrong white went by playing this type of opening that forced him to play knight c3, knight b1. Black now gives a check, and it cannot be blocked with the pawn because you got 1, 2, 3 attackers, whereas white has got 2 defenders. After queen d2 trying to develop, black recaptures the pawn in c5. What's going on here is that basically white cannot develop the light square bishop anywhere. There's no way that he can play the fianchetto because the pawn is stuck. e3 cannot be played because you got pawn takes with an attack on the queen whilst the bishop threatens to trap the rook, so the bishop can't develop. So after knight f3, black plays knight c6, offering more protection to d4, and again this bishop simply cannot develop. e3 is not possible, you can just take the pawn. So what happens after knight a3, trying to develop the knight like that? Black plays g4, another forcing move. So yeah, now we're looking at knight h4 because it would be just crazy to look at knight g1. Otherwise, this is not really a type of game we can cover here whilst we build a repertoire. This is just the white player messing around. This is giving black so much space. So anyway, knight h4, trying to stay in the game. Black plays knight f6. And after castling longside, it looks like maybe the white player has been able, even though he lost so many tempos, by going bishop g5 and then bishop h4 and bishop g3, and then knight c3, knight b1 again, but at least it looks like somewhat developed. However, it's just too late. Black plays knight e4, attacking the queen. Now the queen will have to go to e1, so white keeps retreating the pieces. Queen f4, for example, is not possible because of knight c3 attacking the rook and threatening a pawn in a2. White here has no attack going on, so you can afford to keep destroying the opponent king's area. Taking the knight is not possible because of queen a3 check, and there's a mate in 11 starting from here. So in this position, the queen goes back to e1. Black now plays knight b4, attacking the pawn in a2. And black's position is just fantastic. King b1 maybe looks normal, but still bishop e6 with double attack on the pawn. And pawn pushing to c4 is nonsensical because you can just take en passant with a million threats, or pawn to b3 is met by queen a5. Position is evaluated -11. Very obviously the king can never have access to the dark diagonal because of the very strong bishop we have in the fianchetto. So from the start, d4, d5, bishop g5, c5, and take the pawn. Okay, so we're doing this. h6, bishop moves g5, and then after winning a few tempos, bishop g7, we went through what happens after knight goes to c3 and everything that happens and everything that goes wrong with that. So what happens after c3 looks like a normal move, and white potentially might play this famous blockade of pawns and try to retain the material advantage. Black now plays knight a6, attacking the pawn. b4 is now not possible, although I've encountered this move already. Yes, you may argue that of course it's not possible. It's very obvious. Knight takes pawn, but then of course the pawn can't take back because the bishop will be taking the rook. But after this there's a check, and now black has to play knight c6. We have achieved white having a double isolated pawn basically. So let's go on a few more moves just to see how this game looks like, and then we'll finish this. Knight f3, knight f6, and after knight e5 attacking the knight even further, black plays knight e4. That is a great move. The idea is to put more pressure on the c3 pawn, because this is not just a pawn, but it's also the place where a bishop will be forking king and rook, so white will have to be very careful. Right now, for example, the white player doesn't win material. Yes, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes comes with check, and after bishop to d7 we are fully developed. White can't take the rook, so after queen takes the pawn in d5, black plays knight to c3, attacking the queen. And now knight taking the knight will give birth to an insane scenario where black wins everything. Because knight takes, bishop takes with check, and after the king moves on the same file, so let's say king d1, then you've got this check. So in this position, even after queen to b3, it doesn't change much. Black plays bishop a4, and that's game over. White can't take anything, and also the queen can no longer guard the d1 square where the queen will be checkmating. So in this position, after the knight takes in c6 and pawn takes back, you might argue the queen doesn't have to go to c6, but rather just play queen back to c2, attacking the knight. And it looks like white can play a normal game, but then bishop to f5. There's not much here for white. Black is so much better. One more line, d4, d5, bishop g5, c5, and then taking the pawn. We have to play this pawn's move so we can put the bishop in fianchetto, and after c3 we said we're going to play knight a6. So b4 is not possible. What happens after e3? Normal developing move of the bishop. Now we take the pawn with the knight. We don't want white to mess up our pawn structure. And after knight to f3, queen to b6, thematic. When there is c3 pawn and b2 pawn like this, you're targeting a weakness. So after queen to c1, black plays g4, attacking the knight. The knight has to go. So after knight to d4, let's have a look at this type of idea. It looks like now the fianchetto bishop is neutralized, but black plays h5 with the idea of playing h4, of course. As we all know, h4 here, bishop has to move, so you're gonna trap it. So if white now plays h3, black will play e5, and after the knight moves, let's say knight b5, then you keep attacking the bishop. Bishop moves, and now we attack the knight. The knight has to go. Look at this, it's ridiculous. All of the white pieces are between the first, second, and third rank, including the pawns. And now the stunning move, g3, attacking the bishop. So after pawn takes, it looks like a free pawn, but in reality, when you take and then the bishop takes, knight e4 comes with a tempo on the bishop, so the bishop moves again. And now queen to h6. Positions evaluate about -4. The idea for black now is to play knight g to f6 and then queen to h4, check. And there's not much that the white player can do to avoid it. If he tries to swap pieces, let's say knight to d2, rushing to try to get rid of this incredible knight, then queen e3 becomes possible. If white plays bishop to d3 to attack the knight, then queen h4 is necessary right now before we even develop the knight. King moving anywhere will allow, so let's say king f1, you got this move, king d1, you've got this, and king e2, you got check, king moves, and now queen g2 with a fork on these two pieces.